Welcome to Rooted, Stories of Entrepreneurship and Agribusiness, a podcast from Colorado State University's Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics. I'm your host, Lauren Cheneritas. I'm currently an assistant professor of agricultural business at Colorado State University, where I teach a course on agribusiness entrepreneurship. In this podcast series, we explore stories of how people across the food and agriculture industry identify problems, create solutions, and build or improve businesses that make an impact. What makes Rooted unique is that each episode is co-hosted by students in the agribusiness entrepreneurship course who bring their own curiosity and questions to the table. Their conversations with leaders across food and agriculture are a chance to learn, reflect, and share those insights with you, our audience of students, entrepreneurs, and change makers in food and agriculture. I appreciate your time and attention, and I'm excited to share these inspiring stories with you. Great. I'm joined today by our student co-hosts, Crystal, an equine science major, and Wyatt, an agricultural business major. And our guest today is Erin Spaur. Erin has been with the Colorado Cattlemen's Association since 2015 and was appointed Executive Vice President in 2022. In this role, she oversees the day-to-day administration of the nation's oldest cattlemen's association, including policy advocacy, member engagement, and strategic planning. Her work includes monitoring legislation, collaborating with agencies like Parks and Wildlife and the State Land Board, and managing a mix of member dues, grants, and fundraising efforts. She's currently leading a capital campaign to renovate the association's new headquarters on the National Western Center grounds. Erin got her roots growing up on her family ranch in southeast Colorado, going on to later graduate from the DARE program in 2012. So we welcome Erin to the podcast. Thank you for being here. She's coming at us live from Denver, and I'm going to kick it over to Crystal and Wyatt to start answering our questions.
All right. Erin, as it stands, what do you think the future of beef production in Colorado looks like?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think this is definitely a loaded question as we look at just the changes that Colorado has been facing, and especially over the last decade. But I think what it looks like now and what it continues to look like is, I think, very similar when we think about the diverse landscape of Colorado from the western slope to the eastern plains. And then, what I always continue to advocate for, and when I'm advocating, trying to explain, is Colorado possesses and has the entire beef supply chain represented. So we have cow-calf operations, we have the feedlots, and then also processing and representing all sizes of processing from very small to some of the largest. And I think that is what is so unique about Colorado because of its climate and because of its geography. And so I think as we look into the future, small things may change, but I think overall the beef industry will continue to be prevalent in Colorado.
Well, Erin, another question that we had is, are there any current trends and or new policies that worry you about the future for ranchers and producers in Colorado?
One that has been concerning me actually since I started at CCA is I think we always hear the average age of the rancher is, and it continues to climb each year. Right now it's about 58 years old. And I think, we've been always talking about the just increasing age of the average rancher. But I think what we're seeing because of that age climbing is even more scary in my there was actually a news article that just came out talking about that Colorado has lost more farmland than any other state in the country, and from 2017 to 2022. Colorado's lost 1.6 million acres of farmland. And in that 5-year period, there's a 5% decrease in acreage for farmland. And I think it's a scary reality of what Colorado is facing. But I think if you drive the Front Range, that I-25 corridor, you can see just the changes that have happened in a year, 2 years. And I think what we're seeing on our side is a number of families that are just completely selling out. Cattle prices right now are the highest they've ever been. And so this is an opportune time for that older generation to retire if they don't have a younger generation to come step in to take over their operation. And so we're seeing a lot of cattle leave the landscape, farms sell out. And, I think in Colorado specifically, what's really hard is as we see the population grow, we maybe see facing it at the legislature, one party control, all from the governor all the way down into the legislature. And what we always say is what works best for policy is balance. And I think right now, from a policy perspective, we're seeing it's a little out of balance. And that just leads to stricter regulations. And what we always say is it just all those little things start adding up. And we're now seeing, we can put numbers to what is actually happening on the ground.
So I'm super interested. A couple of points that you mentioned. So the aging population seems to correlate with loss of land that's devoted to production, and so what do you see? Have you chatted with people, kind of younger generations, to understand what are the barriers to enter, and what has the conversation looked like?
Yeah, and I think as we look at Colorado in general, and then also looking at CCA as a whole, in trying to figure out what can we do to help bring that next generation in. Is it education? And I think honestly, the barrier to entry is just affordability and that land access. And so we actually have, with leadership from our president of the association, looking at are there new or creative ways that we could, create grazing associations or some other forms to allow those that are willing and able to want to pursue, ranching or farming or anything, to be able to have access. And I think one of the things that we've always struggled in ag is those that are family and blood, and they grew up in this, in the industry, and then those that maybe didn't grow up in the industry but are just as capable, just as passionate. And I think I would say in our association, there's been a flip, and there's a facing reality that we have to have both. And I think that is what we're looking for, is how do we train and how do we make sure that younger generation is interested. But if it isn't, how do we give opportunities to those that didn't grow up with a family in the operation, but is just as capable and just as passionate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting, especially, with someone not having grown up in that family, someone who's coming from, maybe an optometrist's daughter might want to have her own ranch, but thinking about all the necessary components, aside from running a business, but you talk about the policy landscape. So if you don't grow up in that environment, how might you coach? What is the association's guidance to those younger generation that's coming up, not having been entrenched in that policy conversation, knowing that that's a very big component of how, of information that guides the business, day-to-day business operations?
I really think one of the biggest pieces of advice that I always give people is, I think in my generation, in all the generations, it's sometimes we want immediate gratification. And so it may be like, I want to go to this person and have a set future for the next, 10, 15, 20 years. And I always encourage, and I think we have to change our mentality of we have to put in the work before we can get that certainty. And I think you never know where these little small opportunities may lie. And so I think that is true for when you're looking at opportunities for a potential career or on a farm or a ranch. But I also think it's true, and what I always say in in the association, and when I look at whether it's the Cattlemen's Association or Farm Bureau or any other associations out there representing farmers and ranchers, the first step is getting involved. And the first meeting, and when I see a new person, I always go and talk to them, and they're like, wow, we get so entrenched in just our local kind of area that we forget to kind of step out and remember the broader picture of if it's state or national issues. And then secondly, I think when they continue showing up, they get brought into the fold of whether it's serving on one of our committees um, or moving up into our leadership of our board. But once again, I think it's one of our past presidents said it took 10 to 15 years on a committee before moving up to a board. And so I think it's always making sure you're prepared and you put in the work before moving up. But I think there's so much to learn, whether it's being involved, getting involved, coming to one of our conventions, going to a committee meeting, or even participating in one of the state capitol visits or national capital, going to DC. Your eyes are wide open as you learn about all those policy and how each little policy tweak could have unintended consequences, or it could have these super big benefits that maybe we can't foresee until it's actually in place. I think there's so many policy challenges and opportunities that we faced at the state capitol, whether it's this is outside the state capitol, but it was ballot measures from wolf introduction to I'm thinking about Denver specific ones with the slaughterhouse bans and fur bans. But I think you have to also look outside and see just kind of the trickle down effect of those policy changes or those ballot changes.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, you could be, whether or not you're in production or, working on the Hill, well, whatever hill that might be in DC or in Colorado and Denver. It seems very dynamic and really impactful.
One question I really wanted to ask is, what policies is CCA most focused on changing and advocating for right now, in particular, I guess?
Yeah, I'll start at the state level, and then I'll go to our national issues. But I think when we think about specifically CCA, we always say our policies are rooted in grassroots policy. And what that means is it's all driven from the bottom up, from our local members, and then passed through our committees, and then passed ultimately through our overall membership. And I think that's so important because I think you get a pulse of what's on the ground. And they also, our members drive what are our priorities and what should we focus on. And I'll tell you, some of the biggest ones I've mentioned, but probably take up majority of my time as well as members' times, is from the past ballot measure of wolf introduction to continuing to advocate for producers' needs and working through the challenges of what producers are facing on the ground every day, and whether that's passing policy and advocating for producers at the Wildlife Commission, Parks and Wildlife Commission, or if it's trying to pass a bill at the state capitol. We've been working on this for going on 6 years of just trying to advocate for producers. And I think, a lot of people think that might be centralized to the Western Slope, but it's so much and has broader impacts to what's happening on the ground. The other kind of policy that we've been working on, and in this article that talks about just the loss of farmland, it also talks about ag labor and ag labor policies that have passed through the state legislature, and maybe some unintended consequences that have happened because of that. And we always want to strike a balance between, of course, giving livable and working wages to our workers, because a lot of times we value them like their family, and most of the time we treat them like their family too. But on the same time, they have to be workable for ag operations, understanding that ag operations don't work 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. And so there's some real challenges with ag labor, and just honestly right now, this is kind of on a national front, but trying to find a balance to get availability of labor and workers, and whether that's H2A workers, H2B workers, or other paths forward. We're trying to work through reasonable organizations to just see if we can strike a balance there. So I would say those are two critical ones. I can go through a whole host of other policies, but those are probably the two foremost ones that kind of come to mind.
Yeah, one very hyper local, one very national. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Wyatt.
Okay, as we move on, you previously described the urban and rural divide. Another question we had was, when cities grow into traditional rural areas, what happens to the small farms and rural communities caught within that transition?
Thanks for that question. And I think this brought up, I married into my husband's family farm right on the Front Range of Colorado. And I think we're living through this transition right now of just what had been a traditionally rural area with an abundance of just that farm culture, and slowly as developments move in, losing that. And I think one thing that I never thought until you're living in this transition is it ultimately, if you are the one holding out, or the one that's you want to hold on to that family legacy, which in this case, some of the land has been in my husband's family since his great grandfather moved into it. It's the Johnstown Berthoud area, but you slowly see those businesses, those adjacent businesses that once serviced the farms, whether it's the spray company, whether it's the what you sold, the seed company, or the grain business where you sold your grain, they slowly close down and they leave the area, and it almost makes it impossible to continue operating on, because if you're spraying, all of a sudden they're getting sued by this housing development because they are claiming you killed their trees when they can't. Who knows what happened, but it just continues to be this kind of ripple effect that I was just with someone that said, the land in the farming and ranching community in a family is looked like as another child or another kid. And as you're kind of mourning that loss of losing a kid, there's so many emotions that kind of come up as you kind of see that inevitable loss coming and moving forward. And so that was one thing, as we're kind of living in this transition right now, is one thing that dawned on me, that you don't realize it till you're living it, of just like all of these kind of businesses you depend on a daily basis kind of leaving the area, and then even harder to kind of operate.
Yeah, because if they're not there anymore, then where do you have your substitute supplier, and how far away are they? And that's costs. That's probably going to add costs to the business and how much it costs them to operate, which then puts
Exactly.
pressure on, are they going to stay in business themselves. So those are some really good points. Thank you. Good question.
So as we talked about these challenges that these small families and rural families are facing, what kind of resources or programs are available to help them innovate in starting a new agricultural business? How can that look for changing their operations or building direct to consumer models for them?
Yeah, I think as we came out of COVID, or even during COVID, we saw the direct to consumer definitely boom on the farming and ranching side. And I think we're seeing, those that are marketing well continue on. And I think as we look to those resources available, I continue to, point to the Department of Ag, as well as if the government was open, also USDA to service those farmers and ranchers. But I also think it's making relationships with those that are doing it well too, and making and kind of bouncing ideas off of one another. And I think that's what's so great about agriculture is in this community, it's not viewed, and that's one of the pet peeves if someone does degrade one production method to another, but it's not usually looked at as competition. But I think what we all want to build each other up, because ultimately, in my world, we just want people to eat beef, right? And so if they're eating beef, no matter where they're getting it from, no matter how it's produced, I think that's the ultimate goal. And I think in general agriculture, as long as they're eating meat or grains or whatever is produced, wearing cotton or wool, that's all we could ask for. And so I think any way we can provide resources to young and beginning ranchers and farmers, whether it be education or anything like that, and help kind of give them a peer-to-peer network or that rural network is always will help build up and ultimately help build up the agriculture industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. We talk a lot about incubators and accelerators for maybe non-production activities in the class, and so this seems very similar to that, where you're creating networks in these rural communities so that these up-and-coming ranchers and farmers have a community to tap into. Yeah, great question.
I guess this is kind of a follow-up question. Do you believe that these programs are very reliable and accessible for those families?
I think if people are connected, and depending on what areas people are living in, they are reliable and accessible. But in some areas, I would say they are underserved, or they could use more access to programs. I'm thinking, as you're talking about an incubator, actually one of our past presidents is running a business incubator focused on agriculture in the Mesa County area. And just kind of the success that she's seeing is a lot due to her connection to agriculture, and just to twist people's arm just to come to this meeting or anything like that. And so often people in agriculture are so busy, and it's just making it a priority, or offering free food, honestly, during busy times for them to come in order for them to take interest in it or anything like that. And so I think depending on the area, I would say depends on whether it's reliable and accessible, or and in some areas definitely underserved and could use a network.
Yeah, and when we think about these incubators, I'm going to use that word again too, or any sort of organized group, oftentimes the more formal ones will have resources, like they'll bring in a lawyer or they'll bring in a marketing expert, and then hopefully as we see this grow over time, these communities grow over time, those maybe there'll be like a model or a blueprint to follow on, so that when someone participates in it, it's sort of known what to expect in those things. Like, oh, I'm actually, aside from getting a free dinner or a free lunch, maybe I'm going to really take something home with me and be able to implement it into my business.
Exactly. And I also think, as we see a younger generation that's more comfortable with technology come up, and as we see technologies being formed, whether it's virtual fencing, or I'm also thinking about like data management, or whether it's just some that come to mind are pasture map or whatever. I think it's accessible, and it also makes it easier for people, whether it's record keeping or bookkeeping, or just honestly less resources with fencing. And you don't just some of the stories with the virtual fence of how much time it saved people, and that, especially in agriculture, that's the number one precious resource is time. Is thinking about just innovative and creative ways that you can apply these to an ag operation to ultimately make it more efficient. And as we, talk about some of the policies of just the ag labor, some shortage, and some of those, is as technology can step and kind of ease some of that shortage and other things as you get creative and try to see how to make an efficient operation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so interesting.
Well, since we're talking about these new technologies and adopting them and saving time, how do you think families balance honoring longstanding traditions and practices that have been used for a really long time with adopting those new technologies and new business models like direct to consumer to remain competitive in agriculture?
When I think about my family's operation in Southeast Colorado, my parents didn't have the opportunity. They both grew up in agriculture, but they didn't have the opportunity to inherit, or kind of weren't that those operations weren't big enough for two different families, and so they ultimately built their own operation. And I think um, they, because they were scrappy in building their own operation, they were open to, looking at any technology forward. And even myself, as I was a recent college graduate and would just throw them every like technology or whatever I learned at coming out of college, and they would be open to it. And that's something I've always respected about my parents, is they and because of that, they were always open to it. And because of that, we see, they have focused on genetics and just genetic merit, and we see that it being paid off with the genetics and marbling and grading of our calves, and we have repeat buyers because of that. But I also think there's a place in understanding and honoring, whether it's some of the longstanding traditions, whether it's um, gathering cattle horseback, or some other things that we do because that's the way things have always been done, which used to be my biggest pet peeve when people would tell me that. And as I've seen it now, I'm like, okay, now I understand that phrase a little more. But as a as a recent college graduate, that was one of my biggest pet peeves, of saying we're doing that because that's the way it's always been done. And I would always say, well, why can't we do this or this or this? And I think there is a place for honoring traditions, and then also looking to make sure you're innovating to ensure your operation is here for future operations. I look at CCA as 157-year-old organization as well. And I think we have to balance that on a daily basis of, maintaining those foundational legacies, but also how do we innovate as a modern, trade association into the next 150 years. And so I think that's a constant kind of balance that you have to look at, but ultimately um, making sure that you are being competitive in resources, ensuring that your business is here for the long standing.
Yeah, yeah, and good point too. A lot of your experience is so relatable because what we teach here in the department, we hope that it's translatable to multiple industries, like certainly going back to the farm too, and then are those producers, ranchers, farmers, are they willing to adopt those potentially brand new technologies, which maybe somewhat be intimidating, but they're scientifically backed, and so how do you communicate that to different personality types who may be more or less receptive to the new technology?
Yeah, I remember coming out of my beef systems class, you write your whole beef systems paper. And one of my recommendations was moving calving back to, May, June. And that is still a battle I'm still fighting. So we haven't changed that, but a lot of the other recommendations we have adopted. And it was because of the experience with the animal science department and then also the dairy department, and my dad's financial ability. Everything comes down to finances, and he has an accounting background, but I did a cost benefit analysis comparing technology adoption, whether it be implants or whatever, in cattle versus going kind of the natural way. And actually all of our calves are sold natural, um, and other things, because it actually, as of right now, the market pays for that. And so doing that kind of cost analysis and benefit analysis between the two technologies, whether it be implants or whatever, to the natural cattle, is still something we compare every day to see what we're willing to do and the trade-offs. So yeah, it's fun to look back to see what you actually learned in college and how you applied it. So
Yes, for all the students out there, just save your notes.
So another question we had is, what does the future look like for small farms and rural communities as urban growth continues, and what gives you hope for the future?
uh, yeah, I think as we look at especially farms of all kinds and rural communities, is I think um, this may just be my experience, but I also feel like there's a number of people my age that were high school classmates of mine or college, um, colleagues, that are moving back to their, rural communities or family operations that I've seen recently. And I think that gives me hope, whether if they're taking over their family farm, or they're, honestly just moving to the rural communities because rural communities hold the values that they want to raise their families in. I think that continues to give me hope that those traditions will continue on. But also, I think we have to continue to see that there are places, and there's a place for all sizes of operations, whether it's a large ranch that can, support 3 different families, or it's a small operation that, maybe it's a part-time operation, or it's one spouse gets to work there full time and the other has a job in town. I think there's opportunities for all sizes of operations, but I also think the marketing, the production, everything looks different from that large operation to that small operation. And what also gives me hope is whether it's the COVID effect or just other effects. There's also more of a demand and more of an interest in buying local, supporting local, knowing your farmer, knowing who's raising the food that you're eating. And I really think it's a real opportunity for the agriculture community to step up and also, not only educate, but explain some things that people have questions about, whether it's, you know, pesticide use, water use, those number of issues that we see, because I think for too long we have shied away from those tough questions and just kind of hid out because we were able to do that. And I think as we look at Colorado's landscape changing, the whole United States landscape changing, we can't do that any longer. And I think we have to, step up, feed our neighbors, but also explain what we're doing in the background as well.
Yeah, and I love that, that lifelong learning sort of theme here. What I'm hearing is, for you in particular, what do you read? How do you stay educated yourself? You mentioned an article that you saw, but for folks out there who are interested in staying up to date and current, what are some of the newsletters or things that you follow with and to educate yourself?
Yeah, good question. And I probably don't read as much as I should, but I would say, subscribe to industry publications, and a lot of times they're free, whether it's, cattle facts or any other ag publication. But my whole thing as I commute from, northern Colorado down to Denver every day is podcasts, and then also audiobooks as well. And I
So,
think
looking
there's so
ahead,
many resources.
what would you like to uh, see from policymakers, educators, or just the public in general to support the next generation of farmers and agricultural leaders?
I think the first step is really understanding agriculture. And I think when we look at the makeup specifically of the Colorado legislature, I think 5 of the 100 legislators actually come from rural Colorado. And so I think the first step, and where we've, as an agriculture community, have found real success is, a lot of them don't have a background in agriculture. But honestly, every district has some connection to agriculture, whether it's, a ag business or even if their citizens eat, and so one of the most kind of impactful things that we've done is the legislator tours of going to a farm or a ranch, and then they go to whether it be a feedlot or a different ag operation. And you can see that they're, in a safe space, and they can ask what they think are dumb questions, but are definitely not. And they have the ability to do that. And what we find and what we see from some surveys done by Department of Ag is farmers and ranchers are some of the most trustworthy people in society, second to firefighters. But there's a breakdown in trust when they come because they don't trust production practices. And so I think when they can see a farmer or rancher and meet a farmer and rancher and then see their operation and ask, whether it's about manure on a feedlot or chemicals or pesticide use on a farm, and learning just the background of that, they start to trust more and more. And we've actually seen it pay off, whether it's on legislation that's ultimately not introduced that could be really harmful to the ag industry, or it's they change their position on impactful legislation. And so I think that's maybe the first thing to do. And then the second thing to do is really think about how we get the next generation involved, and what's the most impactful policy changes that we can do. I'm not convinced I'm convinced we're not there yet. And I think we have just some small tweaks to some programs, everything like that. But when I start thinking about just the number of operations that are going to change hands in the next 10 years, I think we have to make monumental change in especially in policy and thinking about how are we going to give all those opportunities to the next generation to set them up for success rather than failure.
Yeah, we're definitely I think, I mean, from my where I sit too, like I see a lot of the things that you're saying just kind of secondhand, and so as an instructor in DARE, are there things that you would recommend myself promote, or things that the students can be doing now to help their community or help set them up for success in the future?
Yeah, I think it's be involved, and I think we have to really look at what is going to make the most change. Because, like I said, I'm not convinced that we are have have really nailed down the ultimate root cause of why people are not coming back to the operation. But I think also as a college student or educator, I think never discounting your position of where you're at either, because I think you don't have to be directly on an operation to make the biggest impact. And that's something I've had to really grapple with and understand myself too, because it was always my goal to be on the operation, and because that's ultimately what I love. But I also have to like tell everyone that sometimes you can have the opportunity to make the biggest change in whether you're working for an ag business or at CSU or going into an adjacent industry that helps farmers and ranchers. And sometimes that's where you can make the biggest difference, and it's not necessarily on an operation on the ground every day.
Yeah, and agribusiness is so much more than, it's so much beyond production.
Yes.
I study, my area of research is on food retail. And so a lot of what I look at on the day to day are marketing trends and what are consumers interested in buying. We bring a lot of that into the classroom in our class, of just what are those new trends, and how can that coexist with the preferences for traditional meat, and conventional conventional production practices. And so, yeah, I think what you're saying here too is, I think there's a place for everyone, and there's so much that agribusiness has to offer beyond production that touches on marketing, data, all these components that all play a role in the food system.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so before we wrap up, we'd love to hear a forward-looking note. What advice would you give to students or families in the agricultural industry, or those running small family farms who are navigating all these changes?
I think as we look at, I think we can always get bogged down by all the negative, whether it's in society or regulations or anything like that. And I think we always have to be positive and look forward. And so I think that's one of the major things, is to not get bogged down by maybe some negative things or the regulations or whatever, but also know there's so many people out there for support systems, whether it's the university, whether it's trade associations like CCA, to reach out to. And I think there's a whole cohort of people willing to help with resources or anything else. And I think as we look at those that are on the ground on farms and ranches or in the ag industry too, it's a pretty isolating industry, and I think we have the tendency to get isolated. And so whether you're on the operation or you're navigating kind of generational change on the operation, the number one thing that I would say is communication, whether it's to your family or the next generation, whoever that may be, or if it's just, you know, coming off of your operation to an industry event. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is talk about it, and talk about whatever the tough thing you you're facing with. And it's amazing once you open up, like how many other people have faced the same challenges or can offer you advice.
Awesome.
And then another question we have is for any of our audience or listeners, where can they learn more about you or your work?
All of Colorado Cattlemen's Association, we're on all except TikTok. We don't do TikTok, not yet. We are on at coloradocattle.org and then Colorado Cattlemen's Association. And then that's the funny thing about Colorado Cattlemen's Association is we span all generations when you think about the operations. And so we have a print magazine, a quarterly print magazine, and then we're also do email and social media. And then that's where you can find the happenings of Colorado Cattlemen's Association.
Stellar. Awesome. You guys did a great job. And thank you to Erin also for being here with us. And with that, we'll just close it out.
All right.
So thanks,
Thank
Erin.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.